Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion event brought to you by the LTO program. My name is Andrew Dodd, and I'm the Worldwide Marketing Communications Manager for HPE StoreEver Tape Storage at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Now, I'm going to be leading today's discussion on behalf of the LTO program, representing IBM, Quantum Corporation, and of course, HPE. And today, I am delighted to be joined by three world-class experts in magnetic media recording and digital storage. Mark Lance from IBM, Turgai Goka from Quantum, and Jeff Spratt from Hewlett Packard Enterprise. So, gentlemen, welcome. Let's get started with an anecdote. When I explain to people that I work in tape storage, then depending on their age, they either give me the look that says, "What storage?" or they show surprise that tape is still a thing that you can make a living from in 2021. So, Mark, if I could begin with a slightly tongue-in-cheek question for you, what are we doing here talking about tape in the early part of the 21st century?
Sure. I suppose to some people it might seem a little strange, but the simple truth is that although we no longer think of tape as a consumer product in commercial terms, or more specifically in storage terms, tape has never gone away. At the end of 2019, pre-COVID, the world was using more tape than ever before, with 114,000 petabytes of LTO capacity shipped that year, and recent research that highlights the vast majority of end users intend to stick with it. So that's the reason we're talking about tape. It's still an important part of the storage landscape. It's a billion-dollar industry supported by some of the biggest names in IT, IBM, Quantum, HPE, and a host of licensees. It provides incredible, secure, and reliable safeguards against the threat of ransomware and cyber attack. And if you look at the LTO technology, we have a roadmap that projects out for the rest of the next decade. Most importantly, businesses are using it as much as ever before.
Yeah, I mean, Turgai, Mark's painted a very rosy picture there. But if you were to follow storage industry news, you could be forgiven for thinking that tape is making a last stand before it gets swept away by all things cloud. So can we begin to get a little deeper into the subject of today's conversation, which is how tape can help with solving some of these challenges that we're going to face in this digital future?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is to define what we really mean by the phrase zettabyte era, which we've been mentioning here. There seems to be a general consensus amongst analysts that the data is growing around 40 to 50% per year. That's massive. Now, this kind of volume is unprecedented. And as we all know, it's going to be driven by the new technology like 5G, Internet of Things, AI. The term big data is a bit cliche, but it is important to bear in mind that we really haven't seen this amount of data before, nor we witness such spectacular growth. What we're dealing with today is nothing compared to what we'll deal tomorrow. By 2025, IDC estimates there will be 7 trillion gigabytes of cold archive data for companies to manage. So this is what we should keep in mind when we say we're entering zettabyte era.
7 trillion gigabytes. I mean, for most people, I mean, that's an unimaginable amount of data. So, I mean, how much do we think of it is going to be stored on tape? I mean, for example, Jeff, in spite of what we've just heard from Mark and Turgai, some people think that tape is dead already, let alone in 5 years' time.
Well, to be honest, we could be back here in 5 years still talking about claims that tape is dead. I've been hearing that message ever since I started working in the tape industry, and that was almost 30 years ago. But seriously, to understand the longevity of tape, or more precisely, tape magnetic recording media, you have to understand the incredible science that underpins it. I think one of the reasons that tape appears quite mundane is because it has been around for so long, but there are still some quite staggering innovations at work in developing today's LTO Ultium solutions.
Now, forgive me, but that sounds a little bit like Arthur C. Clarke's comment that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind that what we're talking about here is a recording medium that is over a kilometre long and 5 times thinner than a human hair. The Library of Congress estimates its current collection contains 39 million books, and information scientists have estimated this represents approximately 15 terabytes of data, but that is still less than the native capacity of a single LTO-9 cartridge. It may not be magic, but I can see why people might view it that way.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. So, look, now that we've warmed up a little, and since we've got your technical expertise for the discussion, I'd like to take audiences a bit deeper now into the main subject, which is obviously tape innovation. So, Turgay, could you give listeners an overview of some of that science that Jeff was just talking about?
Sure. I think the best place to start is what the phrase Jeff has used, tape magnetic media. Tape, like hard disk drives, is a magnetic media. It basically uses the same principles of electromagnetism as means to store its data. So how does that do that? Any magnetic medium, let it be a length of a tape or a hard disk drive platter, has a magnetic surface divided into billions of tiny areas, also known as bit cells. Each one of these areas can be independently affected by an electromagnetic field to store a bit of information. Now, a bit is a binary digit, either a number 1 or number 0. A capital A in ASCII format example is represented by 1 with 5 zeros and 1. Now, I think most people will remember from their physics lessons about school that a magnetic objects have 2 poles, north and a south.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and when we record data to tape or a hard disk drive, it's all about transitions. A transition is north to south or south to north is written to store a 1. If there is no transition written, basically it stores a 0 within that bit cell area. So in the case of the letter A, A for Andrew, you would have to write a transition in the first bit cell to store the 1. And for the next 5 consecutive bit cells, you don't store a transition. That represents 5 zeros. Finally, after that, the next bit cell area, you store a 1, which is your final transition. So when you read the data back, the tape device or disk drive will interpret the magnetic characteristics of bit cell regions, these transitions, to read as 1 with 5 zeros and a 1, or a letter A, restoring your data.
Okay, I mean that's a really clear explanation of how the recording process works. I mean, even with my dim and distant memories of physics at school, I was able to follow that really clearly. So, I mean, Jeff, how does this affect the future development of LTO tape technology then as we enter this zettabyte era? So, I mean, does this process just keep on working and producing bigger and bigger tapes and discs?
That's a very good question, and the answer is not exactly. The thing to bear in mind, and I think it's something we all take for granted, is that tape has reinvented itself generation after generation since the turn of the century. The first LTO-1 cartridges held 200 gigabytes of compressed data and appeared when DDS4 40 gigabytes was a standard. But when LTO-9 cartridges appear in the not-too-distant future, we'll be looking at capacities of up to 45 terabytes compressed, which is a 22,500% increase in storage, even though if you were to hold these 2 cartridges in your hand, aside from the color, they would look identical. Now, if we take a typical mid-range tape library, which holds around 500 tapes when fully expanded, that's going to provide something in the region of 25 petabytes compressed capacity in a 42U rack. To get the same amount of storage using LTO-1, you would have needed 125,000 tapes and a room the size of your high school gymnasium. However, and here I'm going to hand over to Mark, there are some formidable technical challenges that the engineers have had to overcome and will need to keep overcoming to deliver the LTO roadmap. And I think we have to emphasize that these challenges also apply to hard disk drive manufacturers.
Wow. Well, Mark, Jeff's put you on the hot spot there. Thanks to Chief Engineer Scotty on the Starship Enterprise, we all know that you can't change the laws of physics. So what are these challenges and what do they mean for the various roadmaps for tape and disk? Because, obviously the cartridge capacities are only going to get bigger. According to the roadmap, LTO 12 is going to be 360 terabytes a few years from now. And what about hard disk drives and their 3.5-inch form factor? Can their capacities simply keep increasing as well? Sorry, that's a lot of questions there, but maybe you could take them each in turn.
Yeah, lots of questions, but they are good questions. So let me try to break my answers down a bit. We're talking about how do we increase the capacity of a magnetic recording medium. So the thing to remember about both disk and tape is that they have a fixed format. Disk enclosures have to remain a constant size. For LTO, the physical dimensions of the cartridge are the limiting factor. You can't make the tape double in size and a piece of paper going from A4 to A3. It's this fixed format that we stick with over time. It might sound a bit contradictory, but to record more data in a given area, you need to allocate a smaller amount of space to those bit cells we're talking about. This increases the number of bits the surface of a hard disk or a tape can hold. However, when you make the region occupied by each bit smaller, this reduces the signal that you can achieve when you want to read the magnetic state.
So when you say signal, that's signal as in signal to noise ratio, right?
Right, exactly. The signal to noise ratio, or SNR for short, is important in magnetic recording because if you reduce the signal too much, you cannot read back the correct value, this 1 or 0 we were discussing before, to accurately represent the data that you wanted to store.
Okay, but help us out here. Why is it that the signal weakens when the bit cell is made smaller? Because I assume that's not a good thing.
No, not at all. You need good SNR for the recording process. As to why the signal to noise ratio is negatively affected, well, that's due to the characteristics of the magnetic particles that coat the recording surface and enable these 1s and 0s of the bits to be represented on the media. You can see these particles in the illustration. This isn't to scale, it's just to visualize what we're talking about. Each bit cell will contain a certain number of magnetic particles. As the bit cell becomes smaller, the quantity of magnetic particles inside the space that generate a signal for that bit will also decrease, which decreases the amount of signal, hence the signal to noise ratio decreases. I'm sure the audience will be familiar with terms like MP and barium ferrite to describe the characteristics of LTO Ultrium tape. The reason why higher capacity tapes require smaller magnetic particles is to maintain a good signal to noise ratio for each bit cell. Reducing their size restores the higher quantity of particles that can be contained within the boundaries of each bit cell. In other words, it's better to have a higher number of smaller particles than a smaller number of larger particles within the bit cell. And this is true both of magnetic tape and hard disk drives.
Okay, so, at this point, Jeff, it sounds like we've solved the problem. You just keep making the particles even smaller and the capacities will increase.
Well, if only it was as simple as all that. It actually becomes more difficult to shrink the magnetic particles beyond a certain size without compromising their ability to maintain a magnetic state in a stable way. The smallest particle or grain size that is practical to use for magnetic recording media is known as the superparamagnetic limit. As the particles become smaller, they become more susceptible to having their magnetic state influenced by the particles or grains around them. And if they're too small, they may flip their magnetic state randomly, which is obviously a bad thing for long-term data integrity. This impact of the superparamagnetic limit requires high-capacity media to have smaller magnetic particles that have a very high coercivity.
So, could you just describe in a little bit more detail exactly how this relates to coercivity?
Yeah, coercivity is the ability of a magnetic material to resist having its magnetic state changed. Particles with high coercivity have the potential to provide excellent signal-to-noise ratio at very small sizes. It's the reason for the transition from MP to barium ferrite in the past, and now the focus on other technologies such as strontium ferrite that Mark and his team have been working on. Particles with very high corrosivity will enable us to increase the areal density dramatically. Of course, higher corrosivity particles bring their own challenges, because the harder the particles resist having their magnetic state altered, the harder it is to write the ones and zeros.
Right, so it's almost like solving one problem leads then to a different challenge. Mark, I suppose this is a good moment to talk about the recent announcement of the 500 terabyte strontium ferrite prototype. Could you describe what you've been working on and also how this relates to increasing the areal density?
Sure. But let me just add some detail to what Jeff was just talking about with regards to areal density. And you're right about one challenge leading to another one. Areal density is the measurement of how many bits can be stored on a magnetic recording surface. Reducing the size of the particles is one of the key technologies needed to increase the areal density, as this enables us to increase the number of recorded tracks on the surface of the media, because the smaller particles enable you to reduce the track width. And then we start to get into the head design and servo writing, because as the tracks and particles become smaller, the recording mechanism has to be incredibly sensitive and precise. But to stay with areal density, this is commonly expressed in terms of bits per square inch. And it's here that some of the crucial differences between disk and tape start to emerge.
So is that differences in terms of capacity, or rather capacity potential?
Absolutely, because hard disk drives have a much smaller surface area than an LTO tape, a 3.5-inch diameter platter versus a kilometer long of tape in a cartridge. They need much higher areal densities because the bit cells must be much smaller to achieve the same capacity in that form factor.